Let's get into it now. Another spoiler-free review talking about a movie nominated for Best Picture. Anora has 6 nominations, including Best Director, Best Picture, Best Actress, just to name a few. And this is a movie I feel that if you look at all the nominees in the Best Picture category, I feel like it has the most interesting character. And I don't think it's going to win, but I think it's one of those movies that is going to stand the test of time out of all the movies in this category. Probably second on the list would still be The Substance, but I feel sometimes there are these movies that they get nominated and they have a good chance of winning. Obviously, anybody in that category has a good chance of winning, but it feels like it has a little bit more of a fan base that people actually went to go see it. The movie cost $6 million to make, has made about $30 million, which if you look at a lot of these best pictures, sometimes they don't make a whole lot. They're not very profitable, and it's sometimes those movies that go on to win Best Picture. So I feel I do like the fact that anybody has a chance to win, no matter how much you make at the box office. It's about how much of an impact you can make. It's about how novel your movie is, which I think some people don't understand. It's not that it's a movie that the most people saw. It's the movie that came out that defines that year, that really pushed cinema. That's the reason this category exists. But I think Anora will go on to be a movie that people discover more once the Oscars happen, and you see Mikey Madison out there just being so charming on the red carpet talking about it. I think it's the movie that people will give a chance and end up enjoying more, and will be on more people's lists as some of their favorite movies of all time. You have director Sean Baker. So let's get into what this movie is actually about. I pulled the description straight from IMDb because, again, it's a spoiler-free review, and I didn't want to give away all these details that I feel like you learn as the viewer. But even selling this movie, I guess, is a little bit hard because they kind of put a lot of it here in the description. It says, Anora, a young woman from Brooklyn, gets her chance at a Cinderella story when she meets and marries the son of an oligarch. Once the news reaches Russia, her fairy tale is threatened as the parents set out for New York to get the marriage annulled. So Anora is working as a stripper turned escort when she meets this dude. And the reason she meets him is the club owner says, hey, this guy's looking for somebody who speaks Russian. Anora happens to understand Russian, can speak it a little bit, but they send her to deal with him so she can communicate with this guy. Turns out this dude is worth a lot of money. He was at the club just throwing money around. They hit it off. Obviously, I feel like most situations like this with the dude with a lot of money, she realized that. She capitalized on that. And then he asks her if she works outside of the club. She goes to his big fancy house, and that's where you get the Cinderella story of her seeing, man, this dude is loaded, has an amazing house with an amazing view, and he has a lot of money. So given her line of work, she capitalizes on that. And it goes from them just spending an hour together to spending a week together. And then, like the description says, eventually getting married. And I feel like that is a lot of the story. But just knowing all that, you don't know all of the story because so much happens and so much unfolds. And I feel out of all the characters and all the Best Picture nominees, everybody up for Best Actress, I think Anora is the most interesting character on her own. And maybe it's just because it dives into this world that I don't really know a whole lot about. Like, I've never been to a strip club. I don't know what this is like. I really only know from watching movies. But I feel like this was a very raw and accurate representation. And I really felt the evolution of Mikey Madison's character, where it starts out with her just being kind of curious about this guy, to kind of developing a relationship with him, and then seeing it as her opportunity to get out of a really hectic life. And I really felt this from the very beginning of the movie. After they spend that night at the club, it cuts to her being at home in this house that isn't the best living situation. She has a roommate, and it really allows you to see into the life where you just saw her at night kind of being in control of her world and having to do a really tough job, which that is what I felt while watching this movie. I feel like sometimes people think that it's just an easy job. I mean, people say this jokingly, but you hear people say like, well, if nothing else works out, I'll just go be a stripper. I feel like this job is incredibly draining after watching this movie, having to deal with some of the grossest dudes. You know, I just have more respect for the profession after watching this movie. That is how I felt, because then it cuts to her life at home And you see that it's not easy. You see that, okay, maybe you are making a lot of money the night before. There's a big toll that it takes on your mental state. And for Anora, she's really just trying to find her way out of this. And she sees this guy, sees this opportunity as their ticket out, her Cinderella story. I guess they're comparing it to a Cinderella story. I feel like this is what really would have happened in Pretty Woman. Because if you think about Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts, Richard Gere, that would have never happened that way. It wouldn't have had that rom-com feel. That movie, to me, isn't really set in reality. It is a classic movie. It is a great story, but it's very polished. It doesn't feel, well, maybe at the time, I think that movie came out in 1990, probably shot in the late 80s. So maybe at that time it was a little bit more wholesome. I have to imagine it was not. But for something going on right now in the 2020s, I feel like this is the only way you could tell this story. This shows what would actually happen, what would be the implications. And I think I just really enjoyed seeing her character go through so much and really become a different person by the end of it. And the entire movie takes place in about 2 weeks. And to see Mikey kind of go through this evolution of being just this kind of naive person and then having all these people just pile on her when they get so outraged that they get married and they just keep calling her a stripper, a night bat, all these awful things that make it feel really degrading. I will say, if you are somebody who doesn't like a lot of screaming and yelling in a movie, might not be the movie for you, because there are all out screaming matches in this movie. There are moments where they're trying to calm her down and she's just all out belting out and yelling by yelling and screaming and kicking and doing all these things, which I would do too. I would be kicking and screaming too if somebody was trying to take me out of this mansion that I just came to with my new husband. There are moments of this movie that reminded me of how I felt during Uncut Gems and how just nervous and anxious that movie made me feel, where I was literally on the edge of my seat while watching Uncut Gems. It had that chaotic energy where you have all these things going on at once, people yelling and screaming, people getting into fights, and you just kind of had this feeling of something bad is about to happen, something is going to go down. So if you aren't a fan of movies that have chaotic energy, also might not be the movie for you. And I know some people just get annoyed by people screaming, but I think that is part of it. That is part of understanding her character. And I will say this movie has a lot of nudity, and I think Hollywood is kind of getting back into showing not just nudity, but people actually doing it. I think there was a time where I feel Hollywood scaled back with all that was going on, of people being accused of stuff. Everybody wanted to make sure that sets were safe. I honestly think that is why we saw a reduction in scenes like this. However, Anora really just goes all out for it. I'd probably put it on the same scale of Euphoria on HBO. Like an HBO show just goes full out, showing you everything. And it is really polarizing and shocking at the beginning of this movie. So this might take some other people out of consideration of watching this movie if you don't like a lot of nudity, a lot of people hooking up, because that is a big part of the first act, showing you what she has to do for this guy. I think it is put there not so much as a shock value, but as Sean Baker really committing to this, making it something that is a spectacle, is something that you remember. And throughout the course of the movie, it does get away from that. And I think that's honestly where I started to enjoy it more, because the first act is all them just kind of living in a fantasy world. Crap hits the fan in the second act. And then, of course, you have your falling action like you normally would in the third act, where I guess I was expecting a little bit more to happen, because even if you read that description that I read earlier, that really tells you the entire story. And it was not that I got bored in the third act. It just got a little bit less interesting to me. It'd be like going to a road trip where you were going to see like a big monument and you expect to see something really big and grand at the end of it. And then you just kind of drive by like a big tumbleweed and you're like, oh, that was it? Okay. But then I had to look back on it, think about it, and think, well, I think that was just my anticipation of it. I think it was all of the building action that I thought it was going to build up to something wild and something just like, oh, this is why this movie was nominated for Best Picture. I never really got that. But I did get a story about a girl who went through a really crazy couple of weeks, and it ended up just kind of breaking my heart. So this movie was much more of a case of, it's not the destination, it is the journey. For Anora, I give it 4 out of 5. Ooh, I have to be careful here. I give it 4 out of 5 mansions.